Hello, Shavua Tov. Happy Monday, everybody. Okay, we are going to do some very complicated work today, I have to say. I'm a little bit nervous about it. I may have bitten off more than I can chew here. So let's say a blessing and pray for God's help to understand the material today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank God for allowing us to study Torah even when it is very difficult. The Torah that I want to look at today is we're in. Let me just place us. We're in the agricultural section of the Mishnah, the first section, which is I've already told you several times, is not the most exciting section of the Mishnah, but fine, agricultural law. And we're in the laws of tithing. Okay, so we've covered that a little bit before. I'll do a little bit of a quick review before we dive in today, but we were talking about the laws of tithing. In other words, giving a tenth or a tithe of your produce, agricultural produce. And that also, I would say, is not the most exciting discussion in the Mishnah, because it really takes us into the details of like, okay, well, when do you have to tithe lettuce, and when is it when it's ripe, and it's like very, very intricate stuff. But last week we did a kind of an overview of the tithes, just to sort of understand what is this basic system, what is the meaning of it, and we compared it to taxation. It's a tax. It's a portion of your income, your produce, that goes to the state. Imagine, but in this case, the temple, the priests, the infrastructure of this nation. Part of the reason for that, one of the main reasons for that, is that the priests do not have any land of their own. They're supported by the collective, and the priests are in the temple and they're doing the sacrifices, the ancient religion, and the rest of the other tribes supported them with these tithes. Okay, just for here, let me give you last week's. Source sheet. Actually, Emma, if you can find last week's source sheet and just post it in the chat, just so you have the material. But we're not going to review it today. I'll just click through it quickly. The main tithes. There are four major tithes, and it's really three: 3A and 3B. Okay, the first tithe is Truma. And Truma is a donation given to the priests. And there's no amount. You just have to give the best of your produce to the priest, right? The finest. Then there's the first tithe after the Truma, which really is that has a distinction. But the first Maser Rishon goes to the Levites. Now the priests come from the tribe of the Levites, but they're a special family that works in the temple. The Levites also don't own land, but they are part of the priestly collective and support the work of the priests in the temple. So they're like junior priests. The first tithe goes to them. And that's a tenth of your produce every year goes to the tribe of Levi. That's the tribe Moses comes from, tribe Aaron comes from. Okay. And then there's Maser Sheni. There's the second tithe. And Maser Sheni is complicated, and actually that's the tractate of the Talmud we're in this week, the second tithe. What is the second tithe? We went over it last week, but the second tithe is the tithe that, now that you're down to 90% of your produce, you take 10% of that, 9% of the total, right? And you take it and you go and you eat it in Jerusalem, right? You eat the second tithe, you enjoy it. So it's a weird tithe. You take it out, but then you consume it. Except in the third year of a cycle, third, sixth, the seventh it's a 7-year cycle. So in years 3 and 6, that second tithe, Maser Sheni, goes to the poor. Maser Ani, it's called it, but it's really the same. That second tithe in the third year goes to the poor. And we talked a little bit about this, like it seems so strange. That's the tithe we would actually want to see in the system, and yet it only happens, in the second tithing only once every 3 years. And part of the reason for that is that there are other systems that are put in place to support the poor, and we've looked at some of those before, like setting aside the corner of your field for the poor, or whatever you drop as you farm goes to the poor, right? There are obligations to give specifically to the poor that take place regularly, but within the tithing system, one of the tithes goes to the poor, but the bulk of the tithes is going to support the Levite class. Okay, all right. So that's just a little bit of a retread of where we've been. Now we're in Maser Sheni, the tractate that details all of the laws of that second tithe that you go and you eat in Jerusalem, and except in the third year where you give it to the poor. And it's a complicated tithe, so it takes an entire tractate to talk about, because part of what's complicated is that if you don't want to bring all of your produce to Jerusalem because it's just too massive, you can exchange it for money and then go spend the money in Jerusalem, or use that money to buy food, so that you symbolically carry it out. And so they're like spending a lot of time figuring that out, spending a lot of time trying to figure out what can be converted and what can't. And okay, so that's the laws. And I said at the beginning of our journey through the Mishnah here that we're gonna look at the more interesting, the highlights of the Mishnah. We're not gonna spend our time deep in the weeds. And this is really deep in the weeds. Okay, finally getting there. So how do we find the interesting Mishnayot? How do we find the interesting sections of the Mishnah when we are deep in the weeds? Well, one of the techniques that I have recommended before, suggested before, is that it's often the case that the last Mishnah of a tractate is particularly interesting. It's like a cherry on top. There's something unusual often about the last Mishnah. It's like, okay, we've done all the work, and here's a fun story, or here's a weird idea, or here's a new thought. Right? So the last Mishnah. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to jump right to the last Mishnah. And it is, you take a look at the last, I was looking through Master Shani. I was like, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to teach about? This is so boring. Oh my gosh. And maybe, my stepfather used to work for the Department of Agriculture, and I'm sure he would not think it was boring, but I couldn't get much out of it. Anyway, so we come to the last Mishnah, and I see something that looks really interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna share it with you now. Let me put it first in the chat here. Hold on, I have to turn it into a link, right? In order to make it really work. Okay, hold on, I'm gonna do that. It's the HTTP thing. I don't know exactly how that works, so that it's a link but anyway, it doesn't matter now. It just is what it is. We live in a world of robots, and we must obey their commands. Okay, this is the source sheet for today. Okay, so we're gonna read the first Mishnah, or it's really the last Mishnah, and then I think we're not gonna understand it, and we're gonna have to go back and do a ton of work. I said this is gonna be a very complicated class, and there's really kind of part 1 and part 2 of this class. And part 1 is going to be the background work that we're going to have to do to even understand how we got to this Mishnah. And then part 2 will be analyzing the Mishnah itself. And I think it's going to be hard, but if you stick with me, I think it'll be worth it, because there's some really interesting things going on in this Mishnah that tell us a lot about how, I call this class the tithes, they are changing, how the times are changing in this snapshot of rabbinic lore and life. Okay, any questions on what I've said so far before we proceed? Anything just like, wait, I wasn't here last week, or what are you even talking about? Anything need clarification? Okay, all right. So let's take a look. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. Okay, So this is the Mishnah that I want to spend time looking at today. Just you can just hear how cool it sounds, how mysterious and intriguing it sounds, but it's hard to know what they're talking about. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol hevir hodayot hamaser. Yochanan the high priest stopped the recitation of the confession of the tithes. The confession of the tithes. Okay, so first of all, I had never heard that term before until I came upon this Mishnah. Okay, but there's more that Rabbi Yochanan did. He also abolished the wakers and the strikers. That's okay. He abolished the wakers and the strikers. Until his days, the hammer used to beat in Jerusalem. And in his days, one did not have to ask about Demai. Okay, I mean, none of that makes a ton of, like, it's all very like, oh my gosh, the hammer used to beat in Jerusalem and then he came along. But it's like, what are you talking about? None of it makes a ton of sense, except maybe, I mean, we recognize in the first thing that he did, 4 things, right? We recognize in the first thing that he did that they're talking about the tithes. So we're going to spend time unpacking this. Then there's abolishing the wakers and the strikers. And that's really, so he really did 5 things. That's 2 things. Then there's the hammer that doesn't beat anymore. And then finally, there is Demai. Now, Demai we have looked at before. Demai we've seen, if you've been with me in previous classes, you've seen that Demai means like uncertain produce. And there was a rule that the rabbis instituted that you had to ask people before you bought produce whether it had been tithed, and then like in general treat produce that came from uneducated people, produce that came from people who weren't assumed to know about the tithing system. Treat it like it had not been tithed, so you have to tithe it yourself. Okay, so it was a system put into place, Demai, because there was a growing suspicion that people weren't tithing. And so you had to be careful and not buy tithes from people who were known not to tithe or suspected of not tithing, and that's Demai. Okay, so that's the only kind of, other than the tithe itself, that's the only recognizable term. Everything else is mysterious. And what do we learn about Demai? That one in Rabbi Yochanan the high priest's days, one did not have to ask about Demai. So that whole system of checking and making sure and being suspicious of the uneducated, the Amei Haaretz, that whole system he puts to rest. Okay, so now it's like one hint about what is he up to. I mean, that's what we're going to try and figure out. What is Yochanan the high priest up to when he stopped the confession of the tithes? He abolished the wakers and the strikers. He stopped the hammer beating in Jerusalem, and he stopped people from asking about Demai. It's like, seems like a lot's going on, but totally incomprehensible. Okay, I mean, at least to me, unless somebody has like already has an intuition of what's going on here. Okay, another pause. Okay, and I apologize. This class, I'm going to have to do a little more upfront. Nobody has spoken, but me yet, and I hope to end that pattern soon. But this is now part 1. Okay, part 1 is I've just given you a sense of where we're headed with this Mishnah. We'll come back to it, but this Mishnah we're going to need a part 2 to really understand this Mishnah. But part 1 is that we do have actually some material ready at hand that will help us, which you will see if you actually go into the Mishnah. So let's see here. Rabbi Yochanan, the high priest, stopped the recitation of the confession of the tithes. So let's just go in and take a look. He stopped this is the way Sefaria works. You can just click on this and you get into the Mishnah. And if we scrolled back, we would actually see that's actually the last thing that's been described. And I'm just showing you that it's right in the same chapter there. that at Mincha on the last festival day, they would make the confession. Okay? So it turns out we have been discussing the confession of the tithes, which is how we got to this Mishnah in the first place. Okay? So here we are at chapter 5, Mishnah 15. We're going to now just scroll back to Mishnah 10 to figure out what the heck that confession of the tithes is, and that'll be the first major clue we have at understanding what exactly Rabbi Yochanan is doing. Okay, so we're about to go into the confession of the tithes. Again, an institution that was unfamiliar to me, though we'll soon see it's right in front of our faces in a certain way. Alexandra, you have a question.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense of like a historical timeline in my head. And these things all seem like aspects of Christianity to me. And I don't know so I'm wondering like what was the context, what was the sort of broader world or the like host culture of Rabbi Yochanan's time?
Yeah, great. I can answer that a little bit anyway. I'm terrible with dates. Most like yeshiva boys are. But I will tell you that this is a discussion that is happening in the Second Temple period. Okay. So what that means is there's a temple that is like established by King Solomon, and that temple is destroyed in the 6th century before the Common Era, 500s BCE. And the Israelites are exiled to Babylon. That's like by the rivers of Babylon. And they're there for 70 years. And then they are granted permission to go back and Ezra leads the charge. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the last few books of the Bible, are about that, and leads the charge back to Israel, and they rebuild the temple. Okay, so the temple then is standing from about 486 before the Common Era until 70. So like a period of 500. Over 500 years, but that's the Second Temple period. And then in 70, that temple is destroyed. And the Mishnah is written in 220 after the temple is destroyed. Okay, so this Mishnah is going back and telling us about what Rabbi Yochanan, a high priest in the time of the Second Temple, was suddenly doing. Okay, so that's the best I can do. All right.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Just intuitively, the confessions, it seems to me it has to do with that last word in that starts with a D. I don't have the text in front of me. That he abolished the necessity of people to, it's sort of like a tax declaration. I produced that much whatever cabbages, and I did tie the 10% or the of the whole, or the 10% of the whatever I have left. Would that be the confessions?
Yeah, I love that, Marianka. That's very, very, very keen reading, because this is a very cryptic Mishnah, and yet, even in as much as we've already looked for words that we understand, Marianka sees a connection, and I think she's onto something between the first proclamation of Rabbi Yochanan, which is, let's stop declaring the tithes. Something about the confession is about declaring the tithes. And so too with the Mai, you're no longer to inquire and receive declaration. Like, people are, in general, Marianka sees a pattern where Rabbi Yochanan wants to tone down the need to account for and publicly make record of what tithes you have and haven't done. Okay, so that's, I think you're on to something. And in the end, this is where we're headed. What is Rabbi Yochanan trying to do there in Israel? And I think once we understand that, I think we'll actually see that this is like he's instituting major changes. Okay, but Marianka can sort of smell out the sort of where the essence of where we're headed. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's take a look now then at, we have that material. We have the confession it looks, I gave you the Mishnah out of place. It looks like, oh, the confession of the tithes, but actually that's the way the Mishnah works is by association. So they just describe the confession of the tithes. And so in the last Mishnah, they say, oh, you know, speaking of the confession of the tithes, this reminds us of all of the edicts of Rabbi Yochanan, the high priest. So now let's go back and look at what the confession of the tithes is. And this is also complicated, but we're not going to break our heads over it. We're not going to spend hours going through each little section here, but I want you to get a feel for what this is, because the Mishnah is doing something very not unheard of, but atypical here, which is to really go into the Torah and verse by verse give us an explanation of something. And the thing that it's giving us an explanation is the confession of the tithes, which frankly, I will tell you, it's like one of these things in the Torah where it's there all along, it's sitting right in front of us, and I never notice it and I never think about it. So at the very least, we will remind ourselves of what the heck this confession of the tithes is. All right, so let's take a look. Here we go. So so the laws of Maaser Sheni and how you do it have been going on for a while now, and then towards the end of the tractate, the end of the Masechet, we get this announcement, which is that at Mincha, at the afternoon prayer, on the last festival day, meaning the last day of Passover. Okay, Passover is 7 days long, so on the last day of Passover, they would make the confession. What confession? What are they talking about? What confession? Okay, and then suddenly you get the reference, like, because they quote a verse from Deuteronomy 26. Okay, let's just see like what is happening here, and then we're going to go to Deuteronomy 26 to figure out what they're referencing. Oh, and I'm not even on my source sheet. Let me go back to it. It's a little clearer. Okay, so how is the confession made? Well, it says in Deuteronomy 26, I have cleared out the holy portion from the house. This refers to Maaser Sheni, what we've been discussing, the second tithe, and it refers to the second tithe and another agricultural law, the fruit of plants in their fourth year. Okay, so the readers of the Torah, these rabbinic readers of the Torah say this quote from Deuteronomy is a reference to Maaser Sheni. Okay, let's go see the quote in Deuteronomy. As you can see, we're gonna keep moving through that passage in Deuteronomy and explaining what each little section of it means. But let's go look at the passage first so it doesn't seem to us to be like jagged and out of context. So I'm scrolling down now to the next source here, Deuteronomy 26. Okay. Now, I want to place it in a little bit of context. I told you this is going to be so complicated, but I promise it'll be worth it. I want to place it in a little bit of context. What is Deuteronomy 26? Deuteronomy 26 is famously the beginning of Parshat Ki Tavo in Deuteronomy, and the beginning of Parshat Ki Tavo is the recitation of the first fruits, the Bikurim, not the confession, but the first fruits. Okay, and this is that recitation, and actually, it may sound like I'm speaking in just like the most arcane realms of Jewish lore and literature, but I think you'll see that actually this is more familiar than you might think, because what happens is you go into the land that God is giving you, and you take some of the first fruit of your soil, the first things that grow out of the land, and you go to the place which God establishes, meaning the temple, and you go to the priest and you say, and I acknowledge this day that I've come into the land and I've entered, and the priest takes the basket, and then the Torah gives you something to recite, a recitation. And you will probably recognize this recitation from here's the first question. Where have you seen this before? My father was a fugitive.
In the Haggadah.
Oh, okay. Somebody's already answered. In the Haggadah, right. The Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah mentions this recitation. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. And the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, an awesome power, and by signs and portents. God brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, O Lord, have given me. Okay, so that's the first fruits recitation, famous because it was inserted in the Haggadah. Okay, I've been talking. So let me just pause a minute and say, just as we begin to try and figure out where we're at, we're about to see the confession. What is the point of the first fruits? Okay, let's just begin to build some context here. Why do we make the declaration of the first fruits to the priest there when we come into the land? Anyone have a sense of what's the basic, what's the idea that you should declare something? After all, is what we're trying to track. So what's the point of declaring the first and reciting this piece, which is so famous from the Haggadah? Okay, let's take some hands. Richard.
I'm going to imagine that they're saying, I want to belong to this group. I am paying my dues, per se, or my taxes, and I want to be part of this group.
Great. So there's something, you are obligated to give these first fruits, and the declaration shows that you are signing on to this. You are saying, I hereby not just pay my taxes, I pay my taxes and declare that I am a citizen of this great new nation. That I want you to know that I willingly hereby participate in this civic institution because I'm into this, I'm a part of this. Anything else people want to add to, like, what's the point of it? And I'll remind you, there's also like a whole history given. Oh, and part of the declaration is, and we were slaves in Egypt and God rescued us. And so anything else that the Bikurim does there, sort of thematically? Rosa.
Let me unmute. So it's obviously Thanksgiving for being rescued and for, and for all these wonderful things, this wonderful new land. Good.
And that's right. There's some sense that you get that God has done all these things for us, and so I hereby pay tribute with these first fruits. I am so grateful to God for having brought us all this way. Here I am, with great pleasure, I participate in the act of thanking God, of acknowledging to God my indebtedness to God, which I pay through the priests. Okay, all right, that's good. I take us through that a little bit because Parshat Bikurim, this first fruits declaration, is famous. It's well known. It's right there up front, and then it's recorded in the Haggadah. But right after it, in a section that's like overshadowed, there is immediately another declaration that the Torah mentions, and this is the confession of the tithes. So if you're like me, you're wondering, wait, well, I don't remember another declaration. So here it is. Okay, so this is the thing that the Mishnah is going to elaborate on, and that Rabbi Yochanan eventually did away with. So here it is. You leave the first fruits and you bow low and everything's so happy and you go away, and but then there's another declaration. When you have set aside in full the 10th part of your yield, the tithe, in the third year, the year of the tithe, that's the tithe you bring up and eat. The tithe that every 3 years goes to the poor. When you've done that and you've given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat their fill in your settlements, you shall declare before the Lord your God. Here it is. I have cleared out the holy portion from the house, and I have also given it to the Levite, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, just as you commanded me. I have neither transgressed nor neglected any of your commandments. I have not eaten of it while in mourning. I have not cleared out any of it while I was unclean, and I have not deposited any of it with the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God, and I have done just as you commanded me. Look down from your holy abode from heaven and bless your people Israel and the soil you have given us, a land flowing with milk and honey, as you swore to our ancestors. Okay, all right, now things I hope are getting interesting. That's the confession. That's the you are supposed to make some sort of declaration when you have given your tithe, and you say, I have given my tithe, I have done it in the proper way, I've given it all the right people, da, da, da. Okay, now you just heard about the recitation of the first fruits. Now you have another recitation, which we're now calling the confession of the tithes. We heard a little bit about why the first fruits recitation. Richard said, well, we are showing our participation, our allegiance, our affiliation, we're kind of like throwing our chips in with it. Rosa said it's about gratitude. Okay. This tithe declaration, anything else going on? Anything we want? What is this about? I have done all these things. I have not withheld. Why that declaration? Why do we want to make it? I'm going to put it back on the screen. But like, why do we want to make this declaration that not only we give the tithes, but we really say out loud, I have given them, I have given them, I have not withheld, I have not held back. Sivan. Sivan, you there? Okay. Sivan.
And I have also given them is explained as it refers to the standard Truma of Tithes, to the stranger, to the orphans, and to the widow. Is this an explicit commandment, or is it an implied commandment, or is it understood as the very essence of the commandment?
Okay, great. Good question. Do you mean in particular the widow, the orphan, the stranger? Sivan? Okay, I'm gonna answer the question that I think I'm hearing, which is like, what is this declarative confession talking about? What is it? Is it about the tithes to the poor? Is it about all the tithes? What's being referred to here? And Sivan's question anticipates for us exactly what the Mishnah is going to do. So this whole part one of the class, this whole like understanding the confession of the tithes, as we'll soon see, is really a lesson in what's called midrash halacha, which means the interpretation of the verses in the Torah in order to clarify or create or establish the law. So we're going to look at the wording of the confession and see how the Mishnah builds out from it a sense of what this system actually referred to. Okay, Regina.
It sounds like a character reference to me, you know, where you're trying to establish who you are as a person. Also, I wanted to know, is this confession made to the whole community or just to a priest?
Yeah, good question. So I'm thinking about the first thing you said. So part of what the confession is about is declaring that you are righteous, that you are a good person, that you have fulfilled your commandments, that you have not withheld, that you have not, like, the point of the confession is for you to say, I follow the laws, and I follow the priestly laws, and I follow the agricultural laws. I follow those laws, and down to the, you know, the every last jot and tittle, I have followed these laws, and I am a law follower. So that's part of it as well, right? And then what was your second question, Regina?
Who is the confession made to? Is it to the whole community or just to the priest?
Yeah, so good question. But the presumption, given the context, and this is why I took us through the first fruits, the presumption is that it's recited to the priest. It doesn't say, but the other confession was recited to the priest. But even that is like, is it recited to priest or is it recited to God? And the priest just happens to be standing there, right? But you know, and in some ways, you know, same thing. Okay.
It seems like the emphasis on purity and impurity would make it seem like it's confessed to the priest specifically.
Right, and the whole subject matter is priestly, Dina says. The whole subject matter, like it's about the things that I've done and given to primarily to the tribe of Levi, and I've done it. Where is it here? I've not done it while I was unclean. I've not done it while I was impure. I haven't done it while I had any contact with the dead. All of that is priestly stuff. All of that is priestly stuff. So yeah, like part of what I am declaring here is hey priests, I am with you. I fulfill the tithe that supports you. I am a follower of these laws. Okay. Wait, Rosa, are you shaking your head at this? What? Tell me.
Yes, I am shaking my head at that because it says, as you have promised to my forefathers. So therefore you are talking to God. You're not, and the priest just happens to be there.
Right.
So, I mean, the language does not support what you just said.
Good. Okay.
And
okay.
I think what it is that it's a reaffirmation of faith. You're saying it constantly, and therefore you're internalizing it, and you will continue doing it.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. The language here is, Rosa's right, directed toward God. Right? You're talking to God, and that's true in the first fruits as well. Well, let's go take a look. Let's just make sure that we track the language here properly.
Look at verse 3.
Look at verse 3. You should go to the priest in charge of the time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Lord, but then what about, then you shall recite as follows before the Lord your God. So there are things you're saying to the priest, and the priest is there, but it does seem like the first fruits declaration is to God, or you say it at least before God. I mean, now we're in a kind of complicated conversation about whether the priest who receives your words or your offering is a stand-in for God, or whether the priest has his own identity which you are interacting with here. But now let's go take a look. So same thing here. When you set aside the 10th part of your yield, you shall declare before the Lord your God. V'amarta lifnei Adonai Elohecha. So are you talking directly to God? I mean, it's your commandments. You commanded me. So I think we can safely say that the language is directed to God, but Dina's still right that we're talking about priestly things. We're like dealing with the priestly laws, and part of what we're saying to God is, I am grateful for everything you've done. I'm a follower of your commandments. I hereby pay tribute to you, but I will pay tribute to all of the people you have asked me to pay tribute, and I will follow this. I'm going to pay my taxes, right? I'm a believer in this great nation, and so I will pay my taxes, right? Kind of thing. But okay, yes. I like the nuances that are emerging here, and the little bit of ambiguity that we see in ascribing a subject to this speech, or I should say an object to this speech, a receiver of this speech. Matt Silverstein.
I think the way to resolve that question is to ask the hypothetical, if there were a temple and no priests, would you tithe? Are you speaking to God, so you go to the temple and you tithe? Or are you going to the priest running the ceremony and tell God? I think that's the way to cut in and say, which do you do? And I'm going to argue, I'm going to come down on the side of, if there's a temple and no priest, you still tithe.
Yeah, there's a dilemma here, right? Because you have to give, from the days of Jacob. Jacob is the first person who said, if you bless me, if you do everything for me, I will give 1/10 of everything I own to you. So from the days of Jacob, there's an idea that we owe God 10%. but there's a problem. How do you give God 10%? I mean, there are some answers. You could burn it all, like sacrifices, burn it all. But the way that the Torah seems to deal with it is to say, well, yes, you offer sacrifices to God, but in order to keep that system going, you have to fund that system. And that's also considering giving your 10% to God. Right? You pay it to the priest, but it is to God. So it's sort of like, there's a symbolic, the priest, you are in dialogue with the priest, you are giving to the priest, but it's a symbolic dialogue that really represents the conversation with God. Okay, I see lots of great hands up, and I'm going to take two more, and then we're gonna try and move to the second section of the class. Andrea?
I'm bothered by something a little different. This is logistically impossible. There are thousands of people giving these tithes, and there's many words they have to say and few priests. I mean, do we really think this ever happened? And it's recorded at least 200 years later. Yeah. It just seems really difficult to me.
Great question. I feel like we have to sit and imagine, what does it actually mean that there was a confession and that it happened at Mincha, at the afternoon prayer? So it sounds like maybe people would just say it in their prayer. They'd add it to their Mincha prayer. But that doesn't seem like it really fulfills the obligation. So my presumption is that there was a declaration on behalf of the people, but or did everybody say it? The idea of the first fruits really is that you are the one going there to the priest, right? So is this a kind of like real world detail that the Torah is just not concerned with, and like rabbis are gonna have to figure it out? How exactly does this work? I think that is a very good question, and we'll keep it in mind as we see this confession being abolished. I wonder, as Andrea raises the question, how much of it is just like the logistics of like what does it mean to have this ceremony where everybody is doing this? Okay, so that's a good question too. One more comment, then we'll move forward. Tali.
I had a similar question on logistics, but it was more on kind of the publicity of it and the kind of humiliation or shame that could bring of if everyone was there for Mincha and suddenly, I was also thinking kind of if this happened like one by one and it was publicly declared and then it comes to, my turn and I didn't have a good year growing or with my sheep or however that happened and I wasn't then able to declare that and kind of the shame of that idea if it was a public announcement of like, oh, well, Tali didn't declare it and kind of what goes with that.
Okay, excellent. That's excellent. And again, we did this, Rosa did this at the outset, or no, who was it? Marianka did this at the outset. It's sort of like the picking up on the public declaration of it and the way that like, people are declaring in some ways their own righteousness, and what does it look like then, Tali asked, if some people have tithed and some people have not? And some people are able to make this declaration. Some people there on the festival day, they're at the temple and they just sort of like, next, pass, I can't do it.
Sorry, there are the wakers and strikers. Aren't they part of that? I imagine the ceremony and, when they call your name out, the striker calls your name.
Okay,
the waker.
No, so that's different. Okay, so let's get to the wakers and the strikers. Now, we have like now a little bit of better sense of what the confession is, the confession that Rabbi Yochanan is soon to abolish. But I'm not going to take us through the whole of the Mishnah here, but I do want you to just see what Midrash Halacha looks like. Like, what is it that the rabbis are up to when they quote this whole section from Deuteronomy? So here's what they do. They say, oh, how is it made? I have cleared out the holy portion from your house. This refers to Maser Sheni, the second tithe and the fruit of the plants in their fourth year. I have given them to the Levite, and this refers to the tithe of the Levites. And I've also given them it says also, so I've also given them Truma and Truma of tithes to the stranger and the widow and the orphan. This refers to the tithe of the poor. out of the house. This refers to challah, the challah donation. In other words, I'm not going to go through all of this, but in other words, the rabbis spend a lot of time figuring out how that section that we just read in Deuteronomy actually, if you read it carefully, it actually is a compressed version of the entire system of tithing that we've been discussing so far, right? And they read into, if you read through these next few Mishnayot, all of the laws that they've been discussing, you can actually see are there in the Torah. And in this confession, you can see what someone is essentially doing is saying, I have followed all of the laws, not just the basics, but everything that our tradition teaches, that the rabbis teach about the confession. I'm doing it all. I'm following all the laws. I'm a rabbinic Jew, hooray! But I'm also a priestly Jew, hooray! I'm doing it all. Okay? All right. That's the confession of the tithes. Now let's go back to our original Mishnah and try to understand what it means that Rabbi Yochanan abolished this, and then look, and we're going to get some explanations of the other things that Rabbi Yochanan did. And I want us to try and understand, what is Rabbi Yochanan up to, not just in abolishing this confession, but in changing a number of common practices in those Second Temple days. So we're gonna get some help here from one of the great commentators, Rav Ovadia Mibartanura. They sometimes call him just the Bartanura. Okay, so here it is again. The Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan, the high priest, stopped the recitation of the confession of the tithes. He also abolished the wakers and the strikers. Until his days, the hammer used to beat in Jerusalem, and in his days, one did not have to ask about Demai. So here are the explanations that the Bartanura finds in the Jerusalem Talmud and other sources around what's going on in each of these steps. So he says, Rabbi Yochanan, the high priest, who served in the high priesthood in the Second Temple, fine, stopped the confession. Okay, here's the explanation. Since Ezra fined the Levites in that he would not give them the first tithe, for when he went up to the land of Israel from the diaspora, the sons of Levi did not go with him. He commanded that they should give the first tithe to the priests. Okay, kind of complicated, but Ezra has a debate with the Levites, and Ezra wants to return to Jerusalem and reestablish the temple, and the Levites are not supporting him. So Ezra says, we're going to the temple, and actually for not supporting us, you are no longer going to be given the first tithe. The priests will continue to give the priests their tithes, but the whole tribe of Levite, you've lost your tithe. Okay, so there's a little back history, and says the Mibartanura, that's why Rabbi Yochanan stopped the recitation, because it was no longer true. We weren't giving tithes to the Levites anymore. Okay, now that's, I have to say, that's like a historical, little oh, there's a backstory here and it doesn't technically apply to the Levites, and so they can't say it anymore. But what's really going on here? What is Rabbi Yochanan really saying? Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the tithing system is not working like it used to. We're not giving the same tithes to the same people. The whole system is changing. And it's changing because we were exiled and we're back, and there's a whole new reality. Okay. So that's one thing that Ezra did, that Rabbi Yochanan did. But let's take a look at some of the other things. Okay. So Rabbi Yochanan also abolished the wakers. What are the wakers? Well, the Levites would recite on each day on the platform. There's a certain psalm that they recite each day, and they would recite each day Psalm 44, right? And Psalm 44 says, rouse yourself, Ura, lama tishan Hashem, rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? And Rabbi Yochanan said, is there sleep before God? Rabbi Yochanan says, I don't like that language that God needs to be woken up. That's not the God I believe in. So get rid of that. We're not going to recite that anymore. Okay? So don't recite the confession of tithes, because like we're no longer giving the same tithes to the same people. The system is broken down. Don't recite the psalm that says that God should be woken up, because that's just bad theology. God is not a sleeper. Okay, let's keep going. He abolished the strikers. What are the strikers? They would strike the calf, the sacrificial calf between its horns, and blood would fall into its eyes. And then once the blood would fall into its eyes, it would be easy to slaughter it because it wouldn't know what was going on. Well, says Rabbi Yochanan, that's not allowed. That's like damaging the animal before you sacrifice it. And in fact, we have the same issue with modern kosher laws, that you can't torture or hurt an animal before you kill it. Okay, now just tracking this. Abolish the public confession of the tithes because the tithes aren't working. Got rid of the psalm that said that God wakes up every day, because that's just like not the God we believe in. Did away with a practice of around the animals that would invalidate the sacrifices, because in a sense it was cruel to the animals. It would leave a mark on the animals. And then let's see, where are we? The hammer was heard in Jerusalem. In his days, the hammer was no longer heard. Why? Because he says that those who engrave iron and copper would strike it with a hammer to do work that cannot be postponed without loss, which is permissible during Chol HaMoed. In other words, they used to work on Chol HaMoed, but only do certain kinds of work on Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed is the time between the festival days of Passover, the middle of the week. So he said, this is not good that people are working during the festival. So I ban all of the permitted labor that was allowed during the festival. Okay, so there's another change. And then finally, we know the last one, which is that he banned the practice of inquiring about doubtful produce. Demai. You no longer have to go and investigate what's going on, whether some or not someone tithes their produce. Okay, so I said this was awfully complicated, and it is. But we've arrived at a place that I think, like, finally opens itself up to our sort of theorizing about what's going on in this period. So here's what's happened. Rabbi Yochanan is in the Second Temple, and Rabbi Yochanan is presiding over this new temple that's been built in an era when the priestly class is actually falling apart. Okay? So he wants to do several things. He wants to stop this public recitation of the tithes, of people coming and having to say, I tithe, I definitely tithe, they do all the tithing. He wants to stop the recitation of a psalm which describes God in a way that he doesn't believe in. He thinks God is not a sleeper, and so we shouldn't say God is a sleeper. He wants to stop this barbaric treatment of the animals that get beaten over their head during the sacrifices. And he wants to stop people working on the holidays. And he wants to stop this practice of going around and trying to figure out whether people are truly keeping all of the laws of the tithes. Okay, so okay, this has been your very complicated tour through the Mishnah, but now we've arrived at the question, what is Rabbi Yochanan, the high priest, doing? What is he changing? Why do we get a list of these five transformations of society that Rabbi Yochanan spearheaded? What is happening here at the end of our discussion of tithing in the Mishnah? Okay, all right. So now I'm going to turn back to you, and I'm going to take some hands that are up. I don't know if I'm catching them at the right time, but David Yaroslavsky.
So yeah, no, I had my hand up from before but the question about the mincha was and gathering. This was during the temple period, so it wasn't prayer, right? It was sacrifice.
Correct.
When this was happening, I don't know about the logistics of. I was curious about the logistics of how that worked with the sacrifice and then making the recitation during the mincha sacrifice. But I mean, the other, I mean, my thought with all the things that Rabbi Yochanan was doing, or the high priest, is very transformational. I mean, there's the reinterpretation of specific laws, at least with the confession. I mean, it's in the Torah to say this. This is the law. It's clear. There's no wiggle room, and he's saying, no, you don't have to do it anymore because things have changed. And it's an evolutionary interpretation of Judaism. And it's pretty surprising to me that this was what was happening, and it seems pretty dramatic in a lot of different ways, with ethics and reality influencing religious practice.
Okay, thank you so much. Couldn't have had a better plant at the end of the class. You summarized it beautifully, because I think that is, we've done a lot of difficult work, but David is picking up right on what's going on here, which is that we are now in the Second Temple is a strange period in Jewish history, where on the one hand, there's a new temple, and there are sacrifices, and there's a priestly class. All of these old rituals are still taking place, but on the other hand, the Levites are no longer on board, right? The priestly class itself, if you know the period, is getting corrupted, and nobody's sure who the priests are. There are a lot of things that are changing and breaking down, and Rabbi Yochanan is not only acknowledging the sort of difficulty of carrying on these old practices when some of them are no longer relevant, but also, I think, along the way, instituting, well, now that we're in a new period, instituting a bunch of sweeping reforms. Let's think about our theology. Let's think about our ethics. Let's think about how we treat each other when we ask each other, like, hey, do you tithe or not? In other words, it begins with a little bit of a recognition that we're trying to keep this system going, but it's different, and the system no longer fully functions, and so adjustments have to be made. That in the sort of priestly realm. But you can see then Rabbi Yochanan looking around and saying, like, and wait a minute, why are we beating these animals in this barbaric way? And wait a minute, why are people working as if there's nothing wrong on the festival? And wait a minute, why are people, in other words, you can see him capitalizing on this moment of transition and instituting, as David says, some very sweeping reforms, really transforming some of the key elements in Jewish life that he looks around and sees are not working. Okay, we'll take a couple more comments. Payam?
I think he got rid of the confession because it became antithetical to what it stood for. I think at the beginning, the confession was a moral reminder of what you're supposed to do, but then it became a way of showing how much wealth you have. I mean, I see it like as a temple service where you have the priest up top, and then people are making like their confessions, and some guy just says, oh, I gave X amount of, money to this. So it became antithetical to the reason they even instituted it. And he sees this and he says, well, if that's the point of it, you're not doing what the point of what the Torah said in the beginning. So we have to get rid of it to get back to the original purpose of it. And I think that follows with the rest of them.
Good, brilliant, beautiful. Exactly right. I think Payam is taking us one level deeper, which is that's what we're seeing going on in this sort of complicated mess where there are all of a sudden these 5 changes, and it has to do with it. I think Payam's right. What Rabbi Yochanan is seeing is that there were reasons for doing all of these older practices, but the reasons, like, it's become corrupted. People are no longer doing it for the right reasons. It's clear that the declaration of tithes is just a way of saying, I belong to God, grateful to God, I thank God. But it has become a kind of a status symbol. It's become a way of some people asserting religious superiority over others. And so too, Payam suggests that psalm about rousing God, Rabbi Yochanan says, yeah, maybe that psalm was recited with like great spirit in the past, but it's come to mean in people's minds that people think God sleeps at night. It's no longer working. That religious practice is no longer working. There were reasons for like clubbing the animal, but there's something wrong with that. There's something we've missed. Like he's reviewing all of these ancient religious systems and saying, this one has an ethical problem. This one has a social problem. This one's no longer relevant. This one's being misused. We have to look around now that we're here in this second temple period and survey and see what institutions are no longer serving us. And that is quite a radical thing for the high priest to be doing. Abolishing, as David says, laws that are in the Torah. The confession is stated in the Torah. Why did I forget that it was even there? Because it's no longer a part of our sort of public consciousness since the days of Yochanan the high priest. He got rid of it because he saw there were some problems in it, that it was being used for reasons that were no longer religiously palatable to him. All right, let me give the last comment to Jen Bailey.
I'm wondering if he's not also saying not just that their concept of God went awry and needs to be pulled back, but that our concept of God has to evolve and change as well with the practices that evolve and change. And specifically in this case, that it is going to be less anthropomorphized moving forward.
Yes, that's right. As I said, I bit off more than I could chew in this class. So it's like a lot of it was just getting there, but really we need another hour just to think about every single one of these changes that Yochanan institutes. But I think Jen is right that it's really critical that in the midst of them, one of the things that we see is that he is frustrated by the idea that the Levites are reciting this, rouse God from your slumber. And that may be nice poetry, and I know it's in the Psalms. And remember, he's got tension with the Levites, right? The Levites they're not as supportive of the system as they used to be. So he's like, I don't like this idea that they get on the dais and they recite that God wakes up every day. Like you can see Rabbi Yochanan, almost like Maimonides, like 1,000 years later, beginning to shift his theology. He's the high priest, but he doesn't believe in a God that likes to smell sacrifices. He doesn't believe in a God that goes to sleep every night and wakes up in the morning, hungry for breakfast. Like there's a way in which the high priest himself is saying some of the core features of this religion need to be rethought. And what Jen is saying is important because so far we've been thinking about the ways that these religious institutions become irrelevant or flawed or used for the wrong reasons. But there may be something even deeper happening here where Yochanan is sort of subtly saying, I'm not really into some of these core features of the religion. And maybe the idea of sacrifices themselves is not, maybe we should be heading towards something else. Because after all, we do head towards something else. We evolve away from the sacrifice. Maimonides uses this language. We will eventually get to a place where we no longer need to carry out these more primitive rites. And so you can see just a hint of it here in the Second Temple period where they are going to still keep offering sacrifices. They've rebuilt the temple after all. They can't not. And they are going to keep doing a lot of the things that make up the kind of standard features of public life. But here and there, Rabbi Yochanan is trying to insert religious reforms responding to the social reality, responding to ethical concerns. And on some level, we see him also just beginning to believe new things about God, beginning to develop a new sense of what God is and how we relate to God. And so what appears to be just like a few random little changes in stop beating that hammer on the festival. Like that, okay, but that was one of the things he cared about. You can imagine him saying, what's important is that we observe the festival, not that we kill animals. What's so important is that we worship God, not that we wake God up every morning. You can see him this could be a real religious reformer, right? That's what we're seeing here at the end of Tractate Maser Sheni. At the end of our discussion of these tithing laws, we're seeing someone who's saying, yeah, those tithing laws are great, but frankly, that system's breaking down, and we need to rethink how we move this religion into the future. Okay, so I think that was about the densest and most convoluted, intricate class that I have risked. I will not beat you over the head with such textual clubs in the future. But I appreciate you cruising with me through this material. I do think that there's more to be meditated on and reflected on in in this moment here. But I think we've unearthed some of the key elements, the juicy kind of revolutionary core there at the center of it. So thanks everybody. Nice to be with you, and have a wonderful week.